Right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Just a reminder before we begin that as we're going along today, please use the Q&A system to pose any questions you might have that you want to make sure are asked. I'll be moderating Q&A as we go along, and Jennifer's asked that we handle questions along the way just to make sure that we're addressing everything in a timely fashion. So we'll be pausing and answering your questions as we go. If you have ideas or comments, please use the chat for those so that we can keep our questions separate from our commentary and discussion along the way. At the end of our webinar today, we will be emailing out to participants and anybody who registered a copy of our slide deck and a link to a recording of today's session. So if you have to leave early, or for folks who show up late and you miss a portion of today's presentation, do know that you will get that information. The other thing I want to make sure to add at the beginning of all of this is a brief disclaimer. What we're providing today, the information we're providing today, is advisory in nature. Do remember, as I like to summarize, that I am not a lawyer, nor is Jen, and most especially, we are not your lawyers. So for any specific legal guidance coming out of today, please do consult with your district's attorney and treat this as what it is, information for your own edification background, so that you know where a lot of things are coming from with regard to, in this case, school aid and school funding in Michigan. That said, I don't think we're going to be even venturing close to the edge of legal guidance this morning, so I think you guys are safe. And Jen is as close to an expert as we get in this area. And with that, I'd like to introduce our primary presenter today, Jennifer Smith. Jennifer's the Director of Government Relations for the Michigan Association of School Boards, where she's been since 2012. Prior to her time at MASB, she both worked in the House and the Senate as a legislative assistant, a legislative director with individual lawmakers, a policy analyst. She's worked on a number of campaigns and is a proud graduate of Western Michigan University. I will say from a personal perspective that I have worked with Jennifer since she's been with the School Boards Association, and there is nobody who knows the topic of revenues, state taxes, and their impact on school aid better than Jen. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to her as she walks us through how state revenues and the state revenue picture impact school funding, and what exactly did happen to the lottery money and why we aren't just flush with cash.
I didn't know I had to cover the lottery money.
What's in your slides? You got it.
Thanks, Bob, and hi to everyone. I'd also like to add the disclaimer, I am not a CPA, but I took math in high school, so it's fine. I took over the state tax policy crusade when I started at MASB. The funny part of that story is that I was working at the time as a legislative director for the minority vice chair of tax policy in the House. And it was so boring. And so when I was hired here, I told my boss, I'm so glad you rescued me from tax policy. And here we are. But as I started in all this, it really does matter. I don't think we've ever had a real good focus on tax policies and how it affects schools. But it definitely makes a difference. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, this is where the funds come from in the school aid fund. We get most of our money is that state restricted fund. We get about 11% of our budget is federal. And then a very small part that you can't even see the slide is GFGP. The rest of it is all school aid fund money, which can only be used for public school educational purposes as people define it. So our revenue sources, these are the big things that we're going to talk about. If you look at this,
Jen, can you clarify what?
Sorry, general fund, general purpose. That is the state's major fund. So we have two funds in Michigan. We have the school aid fund that funds schools, public schools, and then we have the general fund that funds everything else. It's a little different than other states. Some states, it's just one big fund. But we have that distinction that we have general fund, general purpose money for everything, and then school aid fund for schools. So as you look at this, you see the word tax after a lot of these things. Sales tax is by far our biggest contributor. We receive, since Proposal A, about 73% of the sales tax. If you want to get specific, we get 100% of 2 cents and 60-some% of 4 cents, but it's 73 cents overall. The income tax, we have a formula that we receive a portion of the income tax revenues. It's about 24% of the income tax revenues. The state education tax, that's something we all pay. That's the 6% on your taxes. The lottery transfer, that's that magic pot of money that everybody thinks funds schools. The other one to point out on here that we see a lot, we get that little bit of use tax. Online gaming and sports betting has become, is a growing piece of that pie. And then the real estate transfer tax, which we don't talk about a lot, but in last year they tried to cut it. So the tax revenues, as I said, I sort of went through the pie graph, but the state education tax we all pay, 6% required by the state. The 18 mil non-homestead is levied locally. Each of your districts has to levy that, and it is required by law. In order to receive per pupil funding, your district must levy the 18 mil non-homestead. However, when you buy a house, if it is your principal residence, that gets waived. So the 18 mil non-homestead is paid by second homes, businesses, and things like that, not by individual residents. The things that go into both funds, the income tax. So we have a formula, we're at like 23.8% right now. That is going to increase a little bit over the next few years due to a phase-in of the retirement exemption. So as they phase in more and more that people can exempt, they're going to up the amount that we get from the income tax. Sales and use tax, constitutionally, we get a portion of this. So we get all of the part from Proposal A, and then the 4 cents goes to the general fund, local governments, and the school aid fund, but we get the majority of it. The real estate transfer tax is something you pay if you're if you buy a new house. Again, this is something that people generally don't talk about, but then we had a bill to just eliminate it last session that didn't go anywhere. Online gaming and sports betting is new over the last 5-ish years. And this is a growing industry in Michigan. And so it is a growing pot of money for schools. And then we also get part of the money from tobacco taxes. We get reimbursed for personal property taxes that used to be paid and aren't now. We get sales tax off of liquor taxes. There's all these other little pieces that then also flow into the school aid fund.
Hey, Jen, can I back you up one slide to the pie real quick?
Yes.
So one question I get a lot is about the lottery dollars. And the point with this that you make all the time is that we do get all the lottery money, every dollar of lottery that doesn't go to pay awards, right?
Yeah, so the lottery is set up, it's true. We get all of the revenues from the lottery money. We receive all of the money the lottery takes in minus awards and a very small administrative fee that the Lottery Commission uses to administer it. But if you look at that,
go ahead.
It's $1.3 billion of that whole pie. The lottery money would run our schools for maybe a week. It will not pay for all of our schools. But you see big, beautiful billboards all the time about how much the lottery has given us, and people ask all the time, but what about the lottery? It's true that we get all of the money, but it is just that small part of the pie.
Right, and it's a very large pie, right? $18.5 billion annually. To your point, the lottery money would run schools for about a week, right? It's huge pie. You need huge revenue sources to keep it all going. Thank you.
So the reason we're talking about tax policy and the school aid fund is these next couple of slides. We've put together 10 years of session and the amount of bills and money we've lost or gained through tax policy changes in those 10 years. So you can see, like, in those first 6 years, you've got 40, 50 bills there that were passed and signed into law that made cuts, that a couple of them were increases. But if you look at those numbers for this first 6 years, you've got 8, 10 that make increases, and everything else is a cut. And so every little piece, it might be $1 million, it might be 750,000, but you add it all together, and this is where we're going with all these tax changes. 21-22 was a huge year where 19 bills cut the school aid fund, and 17 of them fiscal can't figure out, because of how the law is written or how it would be applied or anything like that, what that would cost. That does not mean they're small. It could be big. We just don't know. So in order to find out anything where the costs were indeterminate, we would have to go back to Treasury and ask them what happened under this public act. And a lot of times, because we've exempted them, Treasury isn't keeping track act by act what it costs. But these ones that are indeterminate sometimes can be up into the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. 21-22 was also the first time that we received sorry, I lost my train of thought, that we actually received something to hold us harmless from the effects of a cut. We have been yelling about all of these cuts since 2013 on that first slide, but it wasn't until 2021 when we got true language that said we would be reimbursed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So that 10-year total, while these numbers don't look huge, it's $368 million minimum cut, but our minimum increase is bigger than that. So we're seeing an increase for those 10 years of about $40 a pupil. What I want to point out is the 64 bills that we have no idea what they'll cost. That will eat that $40 a pupil in a second. So while the numbers are adding up and the math seems okay, that 64 and not knowing what that costs is really harmful to our fund.
Jen, can you give an example of, like, what when you say tax cut, what might that look like? What might an exemption look like? And why might we not know exactly how much it would cost us?
Great example of one that we don't know what it will cost was when they exempted property taxes for disabled veterans. When they drafted the bill, it simply says property taxes. So all property taxes on any property a disabled veteran owns any property a disabled veteran owns no longer has to pay any property tax. That was one of those that we didn't know what the cost would be. As we went forward, this was costing one particular district in a vacation area, $30 million a year, because the second homes of these veterans were also property tax exempt. And so that was one where we're like, well, it won't be that big because we don't have that many disabled veterans in Michigan. And it turned out for some of these districts, they were losing millions. We've tried to fix that along the way. No one ever really wants to fix it. Another exemption we see a lot is to exempt things from sales and use tax. So you name a thing, we've probably tried to not pay tax on it. And that's the biggest piece of these. We see the property tax exemptions and the sales tax exemptions. Those are the biggest exemptions we see. So one day you're paying sales tax on your delivery and installation services, and the next month you're not because we just exempted it from the tax. We consistently tell them that it's not the tax itself. It's the idea that over and over and over and over again is cutting our revenue streams, and that we really need to talk about what we tax, how we tax, and where the money goes versus this piecemeal attack on the major revenue streams of the school aid fund. So finally, like I said, in 2019, we started to get a little bit of traction. People started paying attention. One of my favorite stories is they were trying to exempt airplane fuel from sales and use tax. We finally got them to change that so that it wouldn't affect the school aid fund. So now the airlines have to pay their tax and then the state gives them a credit. But I remember walking into that hearing once we got the bill subbed and the airline lobbyists coming straight to me. Why are you here? Why are you here? We fixed it. So knowing they don't like when I walk in tells me people are paying attention to the fact that they're cutting schools. We've also seen things held up because they're cutting schools. A big one was the film tax credits in 2023. They were trying to reinstate the film tax credits, and those would have been hundreds of millions of dollars to the school aid fund, and they couldn't figure out how to backfill it, and those ended up dying on the vine. So we have made a difference in beating this drum and telling people that you keep cutting our revenues. So they started to make us feel better by adding intent language that said it is the intent of the legislature to reimburse the school aid fund for losses under this act. However, that's just nice, pretty language to make them feel better. Intent language does not mean they have to do anything, because a current legislature cannot bind the hands of a future one. If you want it paid, you have to say so. So finally, we have language that says the state shall reimburse the school aid fund for losses under this act. We've only been successful 4 times, but these are 4 big things. Data centers was the biggest. When we cut the sales and use tax from data centers, there was only 1 coming into Michigan, and we were still looking at about a $10 million hit. They expanded the data center law last session. So luckily we have this in place. So for any sales and use tax lost on purchases data centers make, we will be reimbursed. And with that massive expansion last year, this protects us from another massive cut. Feminine hygiene products was about a $7 to $10 million hit. That one also put in the language that we shall be reimbursed. Delivery and installation services was not a very big one, but still, the more we can get this put in, the better it is. And then, of course, this year, our big win, I guess, of the road funding fight was getting the sales tax on gas reimbursed. We've heard for years and years and years and years that every penny at the pump should go to roads. Well, starting next year, it will. But they finally found a way, or I would say decided to find a way to hold schools harmless, because they knew at this point we could blow up the entire roads package if they were going to cut us by $750 million to pave the roads. So they set up in the exemption the requirement that the school aid fund be reimbursed for every penny we lose for sales tax at the pump. Treasury doesn't like these things. It makes them do a lot of math. They understand where we're coming from, though, so they only grumble a little. But this is the type of language we're trying to get into any bill that passes to try to hold the school aid fund harmless. But on the flip side, nothing is harmless anymore. Starting in 2010, the legislature made a $150 million loan from the school aid fund to the general fund to cover expenditures for community colleges. This was a huge fight. It was the Granholm administration, a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. They were having a hard time balancing the budget, and she finally talked the Democratic chair of the community college budget into doing this with the promise that it was a loan. Now you can guess what the next sentence I'm going to say is. That was never repaid. So now 2011, you can see there where not only are we paying community college money, but we're also paying toward university operations. Starting with Snyder, he looked at that and said, well, if we can do community colleges, then we can do universities, just the public ones. So every year you can see how that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We currently, and I think since about 2019, have been paying 100% of community college operating dollars. They're fully within the school aid fund. You could make an argument that we're trying to build a K-14 system and maybe community colleges belong in our fund. The argument you can't make is universities. We have fought universities from the beginning. We'd love to get both out, but we have fought universities the hardest. Their budget is almost a $2 billion budget. But whenever the general fund starts to struggle, we see that red line for universities go up and up. And you see the big jump we have this year. They added $400 million for university operations to the school aid fund. So the money going out of the school aid fund for higher ed total, community colleges and universities, is about $1.3 billion. That is almost $1,000 a pupil that is walking out the door to community colleges and universities. On the university side, it's about $615 a kid. And that's just for this year. If you go back and do the math, that's all the money we have been losing through the years. We thought this year that we had the house on our side to remove universities from the school aid fund. Chairman Kelly, the House Education Chair, introduced a resolution to put the question out to the voters in the Constitution to ban universities from university operations money from the school aid fund. That would cut all that red line out, and we would be left with about the $500 million that community colleges get. We were really excited to see this actually introduced because people talk about it all the time, but you never see it. And the idea that it was going to come out of the Republican House gave us a little more hope of then pressuring the Senate Dems to do it. But then we started to get into the roads fund. We started to see the federal big beautiful bill and the way it affects Michigan. And I think legislators, the decision makers, saw the writing on the wall that we don't have enough money to do everything they want to do. And they walked away from that resolution, and we ended up with 400 million more. So while we can get our revenue streams held harmless, this sits out there and continues to eat money out of the school aid fund. So our ask in any conversation we've had with legislators in testimony and committee is that we need to consider protecting local schools and the school aid fund as you consider tax policies. Some of the policies they have passed are a good idea. Sales tax removal on feminine products is a good idea, but it was going to cut the school aid fund. There's some other things about property tax exemptions for low-income housing. Good idea, but it cuts our local schools, which in turn cuts the school aid fund. So while these all may be a good idea, we need to really sit back and look at how we do this, how we tax, and if we're going to exempt some of these things that make sense, aren't there other things that maybe we could tax? But to ask that really turns people off because, as you've probably heard, Michigan is a high tax state. The graph in front of you shows the constitutional limit of revenues the state may collect. And that's up there close to that 10%. It's 9.49% of the income of personal income. That is all the state is allowed to tax. But you can see it has continually dropped off. We've been nowhere near the limit in the last 25 years. Our current rate is closer to 7.3. And the amount that we are under the limit is $12 billion and climbing. So to say we are a high tax state is really disingenuous. And I'm not advocating that we jump all the way back up to 9.49%. What I'm trying to show with this is there is room to grow the pie and not overly burden our taxpayers. But there's just no willingness to do that. And that becomes the problem. But then as we look around our states near us, you can see there that we are lower than most of the states in our region. We are 46th in the country for our tax burden. What they tried to do here, and what CRC tried to do here, the Citizens Research Council, is take all of the various taxes that are taxed on all the people of a state and figure out what that worked out to. Because if you look at some of these states, their property taxes work different than ours. They may have a different sales tax rate, but they may have a hotel tax, like I know Illinois does in the city of Chicago and other places. There's higher taxes there. So what they tried to do was create a effective tax rate. So what you're really being taxed in your state. And they put us at 8.6. The only state lower than us, as you can see, is Tennessee. So as people are talking about us being a high tax state, both the idea that we are $7 billion or more than that, we're so far below the cap where we have been in the past and 46th in the nation, it's hard to buy into that argument that we're a high tax state. But unfortunately, it's a great talking point and people don't have to back it up with the graphs I'm sharing with you. Although sometimes I would like to walk around behind them and hold them out while they're talking about how many taxes we pay. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because it keeps eating at our revenues. But when we piecemeal tax policy, it's going to hit states or parts of the states differently. My example with the veteran property tax, because they exempted every property a veteran owns, vacation areas got hit because all of a sudden those second homes weren't paying the 18 mills into their districts. But that's not going to hit an area that is not a tourist area where there aren't a lot of second homes because you're already not paying property tax on the 18 mills in your first home. It hits demographics differently. When we're talking about cutting sales tax is inherently a regressive tax. It hits poor people worse than it hits wealthier people. And so as we take things in and out of it, excuse me, it's going to hit those demographics different. If we exempt cloud computing, there's probably not a lot of our low-income houses that are using cloud computing, so they're not going to see a break in their taxes. But those people that do stay-at-home business or home-run businesses, things like that, they're going to be able to see a difference. Sorry. It causes confusion. What's taxed and what isn't? Why is this taxed and that's not? And why am I paying it and you're not? And that little bit, like I said before, we've got some that the hit is only $500,000, but we've got others that the hit is $750 million. But you hear in committees when they're running these bills, you hear people say, it's not that much. We don't have to worry about it. Schools aren't being cut that much, which is why we've started as school lobbyists putting this in the bigger picture. You may think this one bill only cuts $1 million, but there are 17 other bills that we're talking about, and those all add up big. Tax policy runs through whatever committee they want to put it in. So sometimes committees don't even realize another committee is doing it. I had one day I was in 4 committees on 4 different tax policies. And every one of them, I pointed out, there are 3 other committees doing this too. So if 4 committees at a time are saying it's just a little bit, it adds up, but they don't necessarily see that connection because not only are they piecemealing the policy, but they're just sending it to whatever committee they think will take it up. And finally, our tax code is a disaster because of all of these various exemptions. Tax codes are already really boring to read, but now they're even longer because you have what isn't taxed. So every time we do an exemption, they have to update the tax code. It gets longer and longer and longer. So if you ever have insomnia, tax code's a great place to go. So as we talk about these different tax policies and how they hit us, it really, to open up that picture bigger, it's almost anything the state is doing will somehow affect the school aid fund. So for economic development, they're earmarking general fund for projects. So now that money is locked away, the general fund can't use it except for that purpose. Or they're promising property or sales tax relief to businesses that want to come into the state to try to entice them to come here. The earmarking of GF puts the higher education budget at risk to coming into our fund. The property and sales tax relief is a direct cut to our local schools and to our school aid fund. But those are the big enticements they use for businesses. Property tax is one of the biggest. You can come here, build your thing. We're not going to charge you anything for it. But what we're losing, because it's a company, is 18 mills to the district for that property, on top of the state property taxes and things like that they would have to pay. So while we're trying to entice development and bring people into an area, we're cutting the revenue that we're giving to their schools to then educate the people that are coming to our area. So economic development becomes a tricky spot because everybody wants more people, but we want it done in a way that if a business comes in and truly does create 1,000 jobs, I'm sure some of those 1,000 people have children, and we want to be able to continue to offer them a quality education, even with the new company. Housing is another one. We had a big housing package in 23-24 that cut property taxes and sales taxes if you were building affordable housing. We testified on this in committee to say, yes, we need more affordable housing in Michigan. Absolutely. But cutting property taxes for the local schools where you are building affordable housing is contradicting what you're trying to do. You're trying to bring more people. You're trying to have more housing for people who can't afford the housing market today, but you're doing it at the expense of the district that is going to educate those kids. Unfortunately, my testimony was met with a snarky remark from one of the senators who said, well, if we don't have houses, you don't have kids, we don't need schools. A little dramatic, but that's the sort of feedback or the pushback that we get on some of these things. Transportation and infrastructure, I talked about that earlier. This can finally, well, it can't go away, but sales tax on gases will be gone in 2026. And every penny at the pump will be going to your roads. They increased the motor fuel tax. They're incrementally increasing that through the next 5 years. And then the sales tax comes off January 1. So that's a fight we've been having forever and ever and ever. But as I said earlier, prior to this year, there was never an interest to backfill the school aid fund. So we never let that happen. Now we're being backfilled, but it doesn't go away because, again, we got 400 million more in higher ed. And while you can't draw a dark straight line, you can certainly see it. And then school operations and infrastructure. Every time you exempt property taxes, or there are also millage exemptions. So they'll exempt district or people or places from CTE, special ed millages, ISD operating millages, the bond millages that you may have. All of that hits districts directly. And then because of how we fund our schools, all of that hits the school aid fund. So that Traverse City district that lost $30 million in property taxes still was getting the same per pupil as everyone else across the state, which means the state has to send more money to Traverse City to make up that gap, which takes away from it looks like a big pie, but it's not that big, but takes away from the pie for everybody else. So even if it is just a district hit, it's going to affect the entire state. And I think that's something our legislators don't always understand as well. So changes in the general fund revenue. So we do receive a little bit of general fund. You can see on the blue line, that's the amount of general fund they've pulled out of our budgets through the years. And then the amount of general fund they've put in. This is especially important when you're talking about the lottery. When you trace this all the way back to when they dedicated the lottery money to the school aid fund, you will see that GF line continually go down. So while the lottery money was flowing in and sometimes increasing, instead of maintaining our pot of money, they took out some of the general fund. So the lottery, while also not maintaining the whole fund, starts to become a wash. The lottery money replaces what they used to pay to the school aid fund in general fund money. This is a harder thing to explain and see, but the lottery is the biggest example. There are other things that have come into the general fund or into the school aid fund that used to be paid with general fund money. Smaller things like school bus inspections. Last year, they wanted to fund DNR field trips out of SAF instead of the DNR budget. So they find these little things that they can put in, and that keeps driving down the amount of school aid dollars that are available for our classrooms.
Jen, just before you move on, you made the point about we've got two moving pieces with general fund here, right? It used to be that a much larger percentage of school funding came from the state's general fund. And over time, that's declined. The lottery was a big example. We raised more school aid fund revenue with lottery, and the state responded by taking away general fund. The other example we have that you talked about is it's sort of two pieces, right? It's things that used to be paid out of the general fund that are now being paid out of the school aid fund. So it's dollars going out and expenses coming in. And you highlighted higher ed and community colleges as two of the really big expenses early on. And then you just gave another example here that I wanted to clarify, which is other sort of education related things that they can justify paying, right? So you gave the examples of DNR field trips and school bus inspections. But as we look at the Michigan Constitution, it says that the school aid fund can be used exclusively for aid to school districts. Well, as you've made the point, that's been interpreted pretty broadly that any sort of program that in any way has nexus to schools, they're able to pay that out of the school aid fund. So not just higher education, but, oh, look, the state police are requiring you to inspect school buses. We'll pay the state police out of your school funding because they're inspecting school buses. The DNR is supporting your field trips, but we'll pay the DNR out of the school aid fund. In other words, we're balancing more and more state expenses out of the school aid fund because there's something that has nexus to schools.
100%. And the school aid fund says it can only fund public education. So it doesn't directly pay the state police. It pays you for the bus inspections that you have to turn around and pay the police that do it. So everything is flowing through you, which I bet if you talk to your business managers, they would love to see some of that go away. But that's how they get around the law that says school aid dollars can only go to public schools, is they set it up so the school is billed, so the school is using their money and it's not directly SAF to the state police or the DNR. It's kind of a in the weeds sort of piece, but it definitely makes a difference.
So for those who are curious, I just put in the chat.
Yeah.
This is just a full list of all of the different things over the years. They're not all currently paid out of school aid, but I keep a running list of what are all the things, and House and Senate Fiscal help us update this every year. But this is a list of all the different things that we've paid out of school aid over the years that used to be paid out of general fund. Everything from school meals to hearing and vision screening for students, local produce and meals, adolescent health centers. These aren't bad programs, right? Just like we were talking about, some tax exemptions or tax cuts aren't bad tax cuts, but the cumulative impact of all of this, when we used to pay for hearing and vision screening out of the general fund, and now we've dumped it into the school aid fund, is that we're taking away, what is it? I think 50 million a year for things like adolescent health centers and hearing and vision screening. And when you add all of that up over the course of a year, what we paid out last year was $151 million of school aid fund to cover the cost of general fund expenditures, not including higher ed and community colleges.
And one that I want to put on a list that is part of this weird circular thinking is Renaissance zone payments. So Renaissance zones are exempted from the SET, the 6% and the 18 mil. In order to reimburse districts for losing property taxes, we're reimbursing them out of our own money. So they're losing the revenue, and we're giving them school aid dollars to fix that revenue, which then, again, it's almost a double hit to the school aid fund because you're getting your Renaissance zone payment, but you're also seeing reduced property taxes. So the school aid fund is paying you for the Renaissance zone and making sure your per pupil stays flat. It's an odd thing to throw in here. We also have, it's not on this list now because it's fairly newer, but personal property tax exemptions for ISDs. We repealed the personal property tax exemption. The law says districts, locals, everything shall be reimbursed, but they didn't include ISDs in that. So years later, after we repealed it, ISDs came back and said, we're still losing money. So instead of putting that into the personal property tax law where we're reimbursed from the locals, they put it into the school aid fund. So the ISDs are not receiving the money they should, but we're going to pay them back out of the money that is ours already, instead of out of the money where it should be coming from. And so they find those different fun ways to use our money, our school money, for things that really should be in the general fund. So what do we do about it? We need to have a bigger conversation versus us just reacting to every tax cut they want to do. But we need to get them to start talking about revenues. And there are various ways we can do that. We can increase the income tax rate. We're currently at 4.25%. I think the highest we've ever been is 4.35, but we haven't been up there in a long time. So even that little bit would increase revenues into the school aid fund because we get about 24% of the income tax. And the income tax is the biggest revenue for the state. We could solidify that we're not giving money to universities. That requires that constitutional amendment. Like I said earlier, you can make an argument for community colleges if you want. But when we look at universities, we've got almost $900 million of their operating budget in our budget already. But there's another 1.3 billion hanging out there in general fund that if the general fund starts to get tight and the school aid fund is doing okay, we could see even more of that shift in. And that's the scary part of the hold harmless is we had the chance for all the people who fought against that 2010 loan. We had a Democratic trifecta. They were the ones fighting the most against that loan. That would have been our chance to get universities out. And instead, because the general fund has become so dependent on the money from the school aid fund, no one is willing to touch it. So unfortunately, this just continues with no end in sight. And sales tax adjustments. What do we tax and how much do we tax it? We continually see things being exempted from the sales tax. What we have proposed in the past, and we continue to talk about this, trying to get people to get on board with it, is we tax things in Michigan. We don't tax services. So part of the reason the school aid fund got such a big bump during COVID was because people had to buy things. They couldn't go do things. But as they could start going to do things again, you saw that revenue calm back down. It was an artificial spike due to the fact that you had to go buy a movie projector. You couldn't go to the movies. So if you go to the movies, you're not paying sales tax on your ticket, but you are on the food. If you go to a salon, you're paying sales tax on the products. You're not paying sales tax on the haircut. So it's that sort of thing that we want to look at. There are a lot of services and they grow more and more every year that we could shift our tax base and broaden our tax base, which the broader your tax base, the more stable it is. But one of the big things we have used as an example is streaming services. When we did sales tax, there were no such thing as a streaming service. Now it's about the only way people are watching TV. it's not taxed. But if you go buy a DVD, which I know a lot of people don't buy those anymore, or a CD or a record or anything like that, if you buy it, you pay sales tax. If you pull it off Apple Music or your streaming service for movies, you don't pay sales tax. So the sales tax law is really uneven, and also moving it to services would help make it less regressive as well. Because my favorite service that we talk about taxing is bronzing baby shoes. One, never knew that existed until we started working on sales tax services. And two, there aren't a lot of low-income families that are bronzing baby shoes. I actually don't know a single person who has ever bronzed baby shoes, but apparently it's an industry. But it's things like that if we add the tax to that, to dry cleaning, to movie tickets, like things that people are using, it has the same idea as where we came up with the sales tax. Things people are using, we will put this tax on. But now we have this huge pot of services out there that are not being taxed. And as we look at that one solution could raise $1 billion. And that alone, like that $1 billion, well, it helps cover universities, I guess, but it is one step that the legislature could do that isn't going to significantly harm the taxpayers, but makes a significant difference in our school aid fund. And not just for us. It would also raise funds for our locals who are consistently seeing their revenue sharing get cut from the state. They get part of the sales tax as well. So it benefits the broader state to do it, but getting someone to say, let's raise a tax is really difficult. So what can we do? What can you do? You can support our efforts in trying to find revenue streams and trying to fight against us. But raise your voice. Push back against those tax cuts that are going to directly hit the school aid fund. And if you ever want to know what's going on, feel free to send me an email and I will send you a long list of what's out there that could cut our revenues. But the bigger thing is advocating for protecting the school aid fund. As we have to fix more roads, as we have to cover holes in our Medicaid because the federal government has cut things, as revenues fall off, the school aid fund should not be the piggy bank for the general fund. And that's something everyone needs to keep saying in the ears of their lawmakers. And try to expand the pie. We have one pie and so many forks in it. It needs to be expanded. And I think people know that, they're just unwilling. But if they hear from constituents that, yeah, we believe schools need more money, it becomes a little easier to have that conversation. But you have to start the conversation. And we invite you to join these conversations. You can advocate for your district, for your community, with your legislator, build that relationship, get to know them, and talk to them about these things. Here we're talking a lot about needing money, but I would say as you build that relationship, you can talk about good things they've done too. Like, don't always go to them and be like, why don't we have more money? They'll stop listening. But if you can build that relationship and be able to have harder conversations with them, you can do these things. You can go to them and be like, why wouldn't we consider X for schools? And in your everyday policy stuff and all the things the legislature keeps making you do, that relationship helps as well. So that you can tell them, like, this is what this does to my school. Because your voice saying that as a principal is stronger than Bob and I going in and saying, well, on a statewide level, this would happen. But you can call and say, no, my school, this will happen, and these are your constituents. So joining the conversation is the biggest thing you can do. And then these are sort of your little talking points.
Right. And you guys are in a much better position than we are to illustrate what that means in your district. We talked 2 weeks ago when we did our budget webinar about differentiated foundation and the impact of the different cost of educating students. And we talked in that about how far we are below where we need to be, right? If we looked at the School Finance Research Collaborative report, it called for more money in the foundation and more money in things like at-risk and special ed. And when we looked at the numbers, we have a record high foundation this year. $10,050 is as high as it's ever been, except that that's still only 87% of where we need to be. School Finance Research Collaborative says we should be at 11,482. We're only doing about half of what we should be doing for at-risk kids. We're doing a fraction of what we should be doing for ELL kids. And so as you're meeting with your legislators and talking to them and advocating on this, one of the best ways to illustrate this for them is to talk about the services that you're trying to provide, that you're struggling to provide, so that you're putting a face on what the dollars mean, so that it's not just a tax cut, it's a loss of opportunity.
Are there any
So-
questions? Oh, it's a lot of numbers.
Yeah, there's a lot of content in, pretty rapid fire way. We'll give folks just another minute or so if they have any last questions. But while we're waiting, Jen, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming today, sharing this information with us, and helping MASSP members contextualize why it is that tax policy has such a meaningful impact on the work that they do in their buildings to support teaching and learning. As we led off with at the beginning of all of this, Jen's slide deck today and a copy of this recording will be shared out with everybody who's on today and anybody else who registered that wasn't able to make it. So if you come back later and you have questions, or you're rewatching this, or you share this with somebody in your district and they have questions, Jen has her contact information there on the screen. You're also always should feel free to reach out to me at MASSP. And I think at this point, you all know where to find me. So Jen, I'm not seeing any questions. I think we've covered it, or at least, completely depressed people to the point that they're not willing to talk anymore.
That's kind of what I do. I bring all the bad news. But thank you for having me. Like I joked in the beginning, I wanted out of tax policy, but the stuff is so interesting and then so important that I want to make sure other people are joining in this fight as well. And thank you all who are here attending for what you do for our students.
All right. Thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day.